don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this podcast, I spoke with Heather Peske, who is the president of the National Council on Teacher Quality. It seems clear to me that the education profession and industry needs to take a close look at thinking about how we can attract and retain effective teachers. So a lot of our conversation centered around an executive summary that they published earlier this year called Reimagining the Teacher Role. As part of that conversation, we touched on the importance of professional collaboration, the idea of intellectual nourishment, what makes for highly effective teaching and learning, the outcomes that are associated with those things, and high-quality instructional resources, and much more. As a reminder, if you are interested in our professional development and learning resources, you can visit us at wegrowteachers.com. There you'll find all of our workshops and services, a lot of blogs, and of course this podcast. If you have questions for me, you can reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. Now here's that conversation with Heather. I'm here with Heather Peske, who is with NCTQ, the National Council on Teacher Quality. As I usually like to do, I want to give you an opportunity to say hello, Heather, and introduce yourself and give any context before we get into the meat of the matter. We may talk about several things, but for sure we're going to talk about an executive report on 5 policy areas and reimagining the teaching role and all that kind of thing. But say hello and give the listeners a bit of background on who you are.
Sounds good. Hi, Drew. It's nice to meet you, and thank you for the invitation to be here. My name is Heather Peske, and I'm the president at the National Council on Teacher Quality, NCTQ. I think it's important for folks to know that I've been working in education for a very long time and started my career in education as a 4th grade teacher, as a classroom teacher. And I will note that yesterday marked my grandmother's birthday. She has passed away, but I trace my roots in teaching back to her. She was a teacher, an elementary teacher in the Miami-Dade public schools, then became a reading specialist, and then led as a principal at one of the first bilingual schools in Miami-Dade. So again, the roots in education and specifically in teaching run very deep in my family, and I feel privileged to have started as a classroom teacher. And now here I am leading the National Council on Teacher Quality, where our mission is to ensure that every child in this nation has access to an effective teacher and to a diverse workforce. And the reason we believe in that so strongly is because we as communities, families, parents know the importance of teachers, and the research supports that. Teachers are the most important in-school factor when it comes to children and their opportunities to an excellent education. So that's me, and that's why I'm here.
Okay, great. So there's some intersections between you and I. My mom was a teacher and a principal. My grandmother, too, was a teacher. Matter of fact, sometimes I'll talk about it on the podcast over here on to my right. In my office here, I have my grandmother's teaching certificate. I don't know if you have any artifacts like that, but my grandmother made for the year in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1933, $960 for the year. So sometimes I share that in workshops with teachers, and they get a chuckle out of that. And then I remind them that they may have contract negotiations coming up, so be careful. It's an interesting lineage, and like you, I have that in my background. I actually tried not to become a teacher, but was drawn into it. Now I have a 17-year-old who thinks she wants to be an elementary teacher, which may be a part of this conversation because we're talking about getting a well-prepared workforce and teacher prep and all of that kind of thing. But let's dive into this. So you have this executive summary. Reimagining the teaching role. I guess it seems like a rhetorical question, but why do we need a rhetorical or an executive summary on reimagining the teaching role?
Well, it's a good question. So NCTQ, we recently released a report that we call Reimagining the Teaching Role. And so the reason that we did this is because we were seeing and hearing from a lot of teachers who were saying that the role of teachers right now doesn't serve the needs of students or the needs of teachers. And so kind of, Drew, a little bit like if you think about the Ford Model T, where you would never take a Ford Model T built more than 100 years ago onto a highway today. Similarly, this traditional model of teaching that we built during an agrarian time isn't really working well for most students and teachers. And so even with some modest gains in recent years, job satisfaction for teachers is pretty low. I would submit to you that less than half of teachers, 46%, would advise their younger self to pursue a career in teaching. And many younger folks, maybe your daughter is an exception to this, say that they're less likely to choose teaching again. So we're really looking at a profession that needs to think about how do we reinvent ourselves as a profession, and what are the better roles for teachers that could better serve teachers and, most importantly, better serve students and their needs. So that's really what drove this work, was really saying, like, how can we think about reimagining the teaching role to improve teacher hiring, to keep teachers in schools and classrooms, and ultimately to lead to better outcomes for students?
Well, so I'm going to pull on my daughter's, aspirations. And as a former classroom teacher myself, and her mother is a former classroom teacher as well, but neither of us in the classroom any longer. I taught for 15 years. And one of the things that I'm wondering about and trying to help my daughter think through are some of those things, right? How do you, if you want to be an elementary educator, wonderful, certainly lots of great things that come with that, and some inherent challenges of which we may talk about here, but also trying to make sure that she doesn't limit herself with, degree or certification or whatever, because in many ways, teachers, while they, practically are very qualified to do lots of things if they're good thinkers and all of those things that good that sort of transcend teaching. On paper, certification doesn't look good to get them into the doors and interviews and things like that, which is a whole other issue. But my concern is if you get in the classroom and then it's just really it is a real challenge. I think you talk about reimagining. And yeah, it's a real struggle, I think, for lots of teachers in so many ways. Maybe you can articulate some of the things that you found. I mean, I can certainly articulate some of them, but what are some of the things that are challenges, key challenges for teachers, retaining teachers and giving them opportunities to really flourish?
Well, Drew, one of the things that teachers tell us about like what they would appreciate or enjoy more about their jobs is more time to collaborate with other teachers. So a survey by a peer organization, Educators for Excellence, found that 63% of teachers seek more time to collaborate with other teachers. And similarly, 50%, half of teachers, would favor teaching in a co-teaching or team teaching model, even one that required increasing class sizes. And another 31% of teachers are open to this idea. So I'll give you an example. Long ago, when I was teaching elementary school, together with another teacher, we built a team teaching model where we had a 3-4-5 combination class. So we had 28 students in our class in grades 3, 4, and 5. She taught half the day and I taught the full day. And it was one of the most challenging, joyful, interesting experiences of my professional career, because I had the opportunity to teach side by side with another teacher focused on this group of students and meeting their needs, but tapping into each of our skills and competencies and interests in order to do right and do even better by our students. So these are the kinds of examples of things that teachers are saying is, we want a chance to work together. We want a chance to have more expertise in particular areas. We want a larger team of people who are focused on the needs of kids. And, I'm making these motions, you can't see because you're listening, but I'm making these motions of my hands coming together. So really coming together as a team to support students. This is the kind of reimagining or strategic staffing that we're talking about.
So one of the things that totally resonates with me, when I left the classroom, I felt isolated. I felt missing opportunities to connect meaningfully with my I guess, peers or colleagues. And I talk quite often about the lack of or the importance of intellectual nourishment. That professional setting where teachers are really getting an opportunity to talk with one another in ways that are not faculty meeting or PLCs or those kinds of things, which are certainly important. But when I taught in California, for example, both the middle school and high school, we had an hour for lunch, which meant that we had all kinds of organic time to just connect with colleagues, and it was a really wonderful kind of opportunity, different from that sort of team teaching, co-teaching that you're mentioning. But then here in Kentucky, where I live now, and I taught for quite a few years, a 24-minute lunch, and you can imagine that's barely time to get to the bathroom and warm up your leftovers and go wash your hands and that kind of thing. So maybe you can say more about, if there's more to say about why is it important to have that collaboration? Is it what are the effects for students? Because obviously that's sort of the first priority. But then also, what is the importance of that collaboration?
Yes, I think there can't be enough said about the importance of collaboration. And I like the phrase you used, Drew, the intellectual nourishment. The research we have about these reimagined teaching roles show us that even though states and districts are still really in the early stages of exploring what it looks like to reimagine the teacher roles, so we're a little bit limited with large scale research, we do know that in some of the places we've looked at, and we have a bunch of case studies that give you examples of places doing this reimagining, that students that are taught in a model where highly effective teachers were paid more to take on additional students and to lead teams of teachers. And I'm talking here about one district in Texas, in Ector County, Texas. In that district, those students experienced higher math and reading achievement than students in schools where the model was not being implemented. And I'll tell you that even for English learners and students who are at risk, they had even larger gains in this team teaching model. And so I think this is connected back to what you used as this phrase, intellectual nourishment, because I think the teachers were so energized and excited about the opportunity to work and learn and develop and better understand and be intellectually catalyzed and challenged, that impacted their students in a very positive way. So we know, for example, right now that there's just a lot being asked of teachers across the nation and in every subject level and every grade, and teachers can't possibly meet all needs of all students by themselves. And so when you're working in collaboration, you're nourishing yourself intellectually, but you're also nourishing your spirit and your soul, and you're collaborating with others in service of students. And so when teachers, and you well know this, having been a teacher, when you're seeing success with your students, that's among the best motivators. So we're really seeing these models that we've profiled as being kind of leaders in thinking about how do we think differently about this profession of teaching, and in particular about this role.
So one of the pieces of the executive summary is the role of state policy. Certainly important and has long been a frustration of mine. I remember I was doing project-based learning in my classroom, and I had a state senator serve as an authentic audience. My students were presenting, so on and so forth. Paul Hornbeck, he's no longer a state senator, but I remember him asking me point blank, he said, "This is great. Why are we not doing more of this?" And I looked back at him, I said, "Good question, Paul. Why are we not doing more of this?" Certainly state legislators and maybe even to some extent the federal Department of Education plays a role there. But as your executive summary sort of points at, the role of state policy, talking about the limits and sort of obstacles or challenges that legislation, I guess, provides in really making, I contend that educators or that state policymakers and those kinds of folks, they really don't have a great understanding, or maybe they have a really outdated understanding of what teaching and learning in school could be. And it's just, sort of cursory, nominal kinds of issues that they're dealing with, sometimes now more culture war kinds of issues. But yeah, I guess talk to us a little bit about the state policy kinds of pressures and recommendations.
Sure. So I will tell you that what we did with this work on reimagining the teacher role is we built this interactive website so that depending upon your role, you can experience the website more customized to what you do. So we looked at this question for states and state leaders. We looked at this question of to what extent are states helping or to what extent are they hindering policies that can help districts implement new staffing models? And so what we looked at is we said, really state policymakers can really catalyze a lot. State policymakers can catalyze a lot of innovation, or they can put up a bunch of barriers. And so we spotlighted a bunch of districts, but let me describe like some of the things we looked at in terms of policies that state leaders can take on. So one idea is to provide funds to be able to seed innovation and also evaluate the results of those innovations. So states could provide pilot funds for districts to be able to try out new models. Just a little bit of funding might go a long way. The state could also allow flexibility. And again, flexibility with accountability for results. So I'm not suggesting like, every district just gets to do what they want to do, but the states could say, you could have different class sizes and you could add more teachers and we're going to hold you accountable for the results, but we're going to allow that flexibility. States could also do things like bringing districts together to leverage networks of districts that are trying out new models and really support implementation. And states have a lot of influence when it comes to data. And so they can really collect data and provide data on teacher performance, as well as guidance on selection. So I'll give you an example, just because sometimes it sounds a little too much like, I don't know, too much policy talk. Here's a more clear example. We looked at Texas, which is one of 3 of the states that we profiled that's really leading the way in implementing policies that might catalyze innovative strategic staffing models. I almost said spur innovative strategic staffing models, but if you're talking about Texas, I don't know if we should mix metaphors with spurs. But in any case, we looked at Texas's policy, and what Texas does in their state is they have something called districts of innovation. And so the State Department of Education, which governs the Texas education system, allows for the districts to apply to become a district of innovation. And what this allows the districts to do is to be able to be waived from certain provisions or certain policy requirements, things like waiving class size requirements or being able to waive like start and end dates of the school year or times of the school year. So the state allows the district to apply to become a district of innovation. And once they're approved, they have to have some sort of plan to describe what they're setting out to do. But what we've seen is that becoming a district of innovation in Texas has allowed for some of the Texas districts to really begin this work of strategic staffing and reimagining teaching roles, of building things like teacher teams or building various levels of teacher mastery. So teachers can become teachers of teachers or lead teachers. And so really it's the state policy of this district of innovation that helps to promote districts to do the innovation and feel comfortable doing it and feel like they're supported by the state in being able to catalyze these new ideas.
So in Kentucky, we've had districts of innovation, and certainly they may not be exactly what you're describing in Texas. One of the questions that I have, and maybe a criticism, is about the sort of effectiveness and accountability. And I'm curious how you all kind of think through this and what you recommend and talk about it. Because one thing that I think I've seen in, not just in Kentucky, but we do a lot of project-based learning work. We think it's really valuable, inquiry, that kind of educational approach. But the sort of tendency, or I guess it's far too common, I think, to see things going on in a sort of spirit of innovation and that kind of thing that looks, what I joke about it as being Pinterest worthy. It probably should be TikTok worthy now, right? It looks really good. It sounds really good. But my concern is, are the students actually learning? Is the approach actually effective? Or is it just behavioral engagement and the kids are having fun? Because I think that's a really valid criticism of the kind of work that I actually advocate for, project-based learning and that kind of thing. And that tends to be what you see, that kind of thing, right? If we're talking about innovation, it's not traditional. So it's something that looks like that. So how do we, not be ham-fisted and heavy-handed about accountability, but actually, I mean, it's in your organization's name, right? The quality, right? How do we ensure that quality?
It's a good question. And recently I was with a group of students, and these are students in graduate school, and they were saying, Heather, how does your organization define teacher quality? You're the National Council on Teacher Quality. How do you define it? So first, Drew, I would note, I really appreciate your emphasis on outcomes. And I think sometimes in education, we're really excited and enthusiastic about a particular program, but not always as good about questioning ourselves and saying, well, what are the outcomes? And so when it comes to reimagining teacher roles, I always say that we need to start by describing what the goals are for students. And so certainly we want these reimagined roles to well serve teachers and to attract them to teaching and keep them in teaching, even keep them even longer. But we need to start when we do the design by saying, what are we setting out to do when it comes to students? So I'll give you an example. Right now across the country, our results in math for students are quite poor. And we're really struggling to support students to accelerate their learning and even continue to make up gains from the pandemic. And so if I were going to build a reimagined role for teachers, I might start out by saying, we've got a bunch of 7th graders or 8th graders in our middle school, and their math results are really low. And even more specifically, they're not understanding the following concepts, and I might describe those. And then I might say, how can we build a structure of teachers around the outcome goal of improving the students' math results? And so rather than just sort of designing a bunch of reimagined roles, I think you have to think first about what specifically is the goal for students, and how do we backward map from that in terms of planning for roles for teachers. And we should be good at this because that's a good teaching, right? What's the outcome goal we want for kids?
Should be doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Exactly. So, and in terms of accountability, I think there are a lot of measures. I'm talking about, of course, state assessment results, district assessments, both summative and formative assessments. But I'm also talking about things like students' responses to surveys. What do kids say when you ask them if they feel like they belong in the class, or whether their spirit of belonging is being fostered, or whether they feel included? There are a number of different measures that we should be using, and we should really be asking students, how do you feel about your experience in school? And how is that reflected in a number of different outcome goals and measures? But really, I think it's so important to start with the goals for students and then build the structures for the adults around the kids' needs.
Yeah, well, you get no argument from me there. It's a sort of evaluation and, being critical of those programs that you're engaging in a healthy way, right? To say, what would it look like if it's successful, and then let's check to make sure it's successful instead of just making it look Pinterest worthy or TikTok worthy. You mentioned math, and I know earlier this year you put out a report on reading, and our math and reading scores. I mean, the performance of our students, on testing and that kind of thing in math and reading is woefully inadequate. And one of the things is about teacher quality and teacher preparation, right? The science of reading, and really thinking about the pedagogy that will deliver the results. So maybe you can talk a bit about how you think about instructional approaches, and because that's teacher quality. It's what is it that we need to do in terms of teacher prep, and then what should we expect from our teachers in terms of quality instructional approaches?
Well, I think it's important to know as well, and I didn't say this when I was introducing myself, that I served for almost a decade as a leader at our State Department of Education in my home state of Massachusetts. And so in addition to having been a former teacher, I also like thinking about systems. And so in this case, I think we need to think about the systems to support teachers to be most effective. And you need to start along the continuum of teachers' development. So you need to start with teacher preparation. And then we need to go all the way into the in-service and support teachers and support their capacity to be good at teaching reading. And so I'll be more specific. So NCTQ put out a report, last January of 2020, the beginning of the year, 2024 in January. And what we did is we looked at states and we looked at 5 policy levers, we called them. So if you think of something you can pull that would have impact, these 5 policy levers. And we were looking at them to say, what can we do as states and as schools and districts in order to improve the teaching of reading? And so here are the 5 policy levers, Drew. The first is that across the country, we need to do more as states to set specific standards for educator preparation programs so that they are teaching aspiring teachers to teach reading in ways that align with our very strong, very good science and very good research. Some people call this the science of reading. So first, states need to set standards for the educator preparation programs to ensure that they're aligning their programs with the best research we have on teaching reading. And the second thing we need to do, back to our conversation a minute ago about accountability, is make sure that the states are actually reviewing the teacher preparation programs against these standards. So that's the second policy lever that we described. The third is to make sure that states are adopting really strong licensure tests. We touched on this a little bit at the beginning of our conversation. So when it comes to reading, there are some licensure tests on the market that are actually pretty weak, and there are others that are quite strong. And so NCTQ looked at states and we looked at these reading licensure tests, and we identified which of them are strong licensure tests. Strong meaning that they're well aligned with the best of our research on reading, the science of reading. The fourth thing gets a little bit more into actually being in school once you've passed your licensure test and you become a teacher. And that is that we were advocating for states to require the use of high quality curriculum. So I think, you just described Pinterest, and I remember like being a teacher and pulling together, spending weekends and nights pulling together the lesson plans and the curriculum. Teachers shouldn't have to do that. It's not a good use of their time. There's a lot of really good, strong reading curriculum that's out there that is very well aligned with the science and how you should be teaching reading. So states need to make sure that teachers are given access to these high quality curriculum materials. And then the last lever, the fifth of them, is that states should make sure that the teachers have the time to have professional learning. And in terms of reading, they really need professional learning in how to teach those high quality curriculum materials. And they also need professional learning to make sure that they understand the best research on how to teach reading. I mean, one of the most heartbreaking things about reading right now is when teachers realize that they've been teaching reading in a way that's misaligned from the best science and the best research. Because they think about the many, many students who've been in their classes who didn't get the best instruction and who then struggled to read. So we really need to make sure this fifth lever, this fifth dimension, is to strengthen teachers' capacity to teach reading by providing them with opportunities, and you focus on this all the time in your podcast, providing teachers with opportunities to have access to professional learning, to professional development that's aligned to high quality curriculum materials and aligned to the best of our research. And if we don't do that, we're not well serving teachers, we're wasting time, and we're sending them back into classrooms not prepared to be effective with students. And that's not fair to teachers or to students.
Right. So you mentioned the high quality instructional resources or curriculum, which I think is obviously important. Maybe not everybody thinks it's obvious. I think it's a really good point I've seen made. You talked about pulling things together on your own versus giving teachers and curriculum and materials so that they're not having to do that. I think that's actually a really great idea, and I know Kentucky's moving towards that. I'm curious, did you use What Works Clearinghouse as sort of, say this is they are all high quality instructional resources, or if there's something different in terms of how you deem what's high quality? But then as sort of an extension to that question, and I know Kentucky's doing some work on this, and we're looking to help some districts with this kind of thing, because we've seen some of those listed as high quality, and some of them are okay, but I like to use the surface deep and transfer learning sort of framework of John Hattie's language. You can use DOKs or whatever, but not all of those, and actually quite often I would see some of those quote unquote high quality instructional resources not really putting teachers in a great place for getting to the deep and transfer learning. Perhaps some surface learning, perhaps not particularly engaging, which is certainly better than not having good materials, or sometimes, again, back to my criticism of like behavioral engaging work, but not actually cognitively or academically or intellectually engaging. So, like how do you deem, or what do you deem as high quality? But then are there any sort of suggestions or work that you all do in terms of helping teachers actually scale some of those resources and curriculum up to actually get to, DOK 4 or surface and deep and transfer, or whatever framework you like to use?
Yes, this could be 4 more podcasts,
right?
The question is, what is high quality curriculum? What am I talking about? I think I would say the curriculum needs to be aligned with the best of our research. That's one part. And so curriculum that has a bunch of debunked methods or practices that are not instructionally sound, we shouldn't be using that. And that's maybe very obvious. So more to the question of how do I identify high quality curriculum? States are doing various things. And so some states are producing lists themselves where they've reviewed the curriculum materials. Other states are relying on the What Works Clearinghouse, which is a great resource. Some states are relying on Ed Reports, which is a national nonprofit that reviews curriculum materials and produces reviews and reports. Some states are using the Reading League's recently released Compass tool, which helps to do reviews and analysis of curriculum materials. So it kind of, in some ways, it depends on the state. But if I'm talking to a teacher who's saying, Heather, I'm not exactly sure what to use, then I think I would start by going to the state itself to see if there's an approved list. And if not, I might go to Ed Reports or to the Reading League, to one of those tools where they've already done the reviews of these curricular materials. Now, I will tell you too, having been a former state policymaker, as I said, here in Massachusetts, we built a system that we call Curate, which stands for Curriculum Ratings by Teachers. That's our fancy acronym for Curriculum Ratings by Teachers.
Another acronym, great.
I know, yet one more. But the reason we built this is because we felt it was so important that teachers themselves are involved in the process of reviewing and approving and rating and providing feedback on curriculum materials. And I know a lot of folks at state levels who also think that way. Because I think it's so important to invest teachers from the beginning in reviewing the materials and in helping to provide feedback. So here in Massachusetts, one of our judgments of high quality is the question of how usable is this curriculum for teachers? How much time does it take for teachers to spend to be able to effectively use the curriculum? And that's another dimension in addition to the question of, is it aligned to the best of our sciences? So questions like, is it aligned to the research? Can teachers use it? Is it educative? Meaning, does it help teachers understand the concepts even while they're preparing to teach the concepts and prepare the lessons? Does the curriculum serve English learners well? Does it serve struggling readers well? And if the answer to that is no, then the question is, well, why are we using this, or what should we be doing differently? And Drew, I just want to make sure that I say, at the end of the day, teachers are the ones who know their students the best. And so we need to also trust and depend on teachers, again, with a lot of support, to be able to well use the curriculum and to well use that curriculum in the context of their own students. And so that's really how I think about high quality curriculum materials. I think teachers deserve them, and so do their students.
So you mentioned research, and that's been something that I have had a lot of conversation on the podcast here, as I mentioned, and I think about, educational approaches or instructional approaches as being a spectrum. On one, you've got the traditional, on the other end, progressive, and there's lots of space in between. There's caricatures and versions of it on either end that, it becomes a tribal sort of direct instruction or inquiry or blah, blah, blah. But I do think the science of learning, that when we talk about research, I think, at least my impression is that when people talk about research, that's what they're often talking about. And I think that's important. I think it's valid. I think a lot of teachers don't have time, don't have the opportunity, don't even maybe know that research is out there and that they should be looking at it, which is, again, somewhat of an indictment of teacher preparation programs. But my question is regarding the research, because I get lots of people saying, well, what's the research show about inquiry? What's it show about project-based learning? And it can be a little bit slippery to try to figure that out, to say, I can share some research, and they say, yes, but it's not efficient. It's not this, it's not this. My response to that is that inquiry or, those kinds of approaches can look a lot of different ways, and the outcomes, the academic outcomes, are a little bit more ambiguous and not as concrete as a change in long-term memory. So I guess my question is, how do you think about what is quality research? And when we're thinking about innovation and doing things that are maybe a bit outside of, let's say, the science of learning kind of research, which again I think is important. I keep saying that over and over to people, but we also, I think, need to be using some instructional approaches outside of direct or explicit instruction if we're going to prepare our students for the modern world.
Yeah, I think the question for me is always about what are the outcomes that we see for students, and what's the evidence that we see. And the federal government and the What Works Clearinghouse you mentioned before. So just to be clear, the What Works Clearinghouse is a center based at the Institute for Educational Sciences, which is part of the federal government, the U.S. Department of Education. And so the What Works Clearinghouse and through federal legislation, federal law called the Every Student Succeeds Act, they've identified these tiers of evidence. And so these tiers of evidence are designed to ensure that states and districts and schools can identify the programs, the practices, the products, and also the policies that work across various populations of students. So I think that seeing these different tiers of evidence are helpful to being able to understand how strong is this research. And so they have these various tiers about evidence. And I think that it's a helpful way to think about, as we're making decisions as educators, how strong is the evidence behind the program or the policy that we're about to implement. And so if folks want to hear more about it, obviously I'm always happy to talk about it, but it's helpful to know these different tiers of evidence that exist. But at the end of the day, as you've said at the beginning, Drew, at the end of the day, we have to ground our decisions as teachers, as principals, as superintendents, as state policymakers. We have to ground our decisions in the evidence around what works for students in producing positive outcomes. And if we don't have good evidence, then we really should not be using or implementing those policies.
Yeah, well, as you said, I think it's really important to clarify what those outcomes are and make sure that we have a width and depth of outcomes and not be too narrow in that. But that's a different podcast. I know we're running short on time. What, if anything, have we not talked about or that you want to mention? And if there's nothing, then links or anything that you'd like to share, now's the time.
Well, thanks so much, Drew. I think I would just emphasize, we started this conversation talking about reimagining the role for teachers. And that is critically important in order to have better outcomes for students and in order to attract and retain strong teachers in the profession. And so if folks are curious and interested, I would suggest that you go to nctq.org. That's the National Council on Teacher Quality's website. And look at our new report, Reimagining the Teaching Role. And really, it's customized. It's a tailored, interactive website for you as listeners, whether you're a teacher, a principal in a district, whether you're at the state, whether you work for a teacher preparation program. We've customized this website to look at our Reimagining the Teaching Role website from your perspective, to get resources, to get information, to get sort of highlights of other places doing this work. So if you're interested in reimagining the teaching role, I urge you to go to nctq.org and look up our website and look into our report on reimagining the teaching role. Yeah. And thank you so much. I appreciate your willingness and interest today.
Yeah. And so we'll put nctq.org in the show notes, but then also reimagineteaching.nctq.org will bring you to that. There's some other things that we certainly didn't talk about: class size, teachers as observers, team outcomes, restrictions on use of support and staff and time, and much more. So definitely check that out, listeners, if you are interested. And Heather, thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Drew. It's reimagineteaching.nctq.org, and we'll put it in the chat. And thank you so much for your interest and for the great conversation. I enjoyed getting to know you.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.